Today I want to talk about 1920s culture. So if you'd like to follow along, just download the 1920s culture PowerPoint. Now, during the 1920s, they're called the Roaring Twenties because the economy is so good. There's three Republican presidents. There's prosperity. Consumption rises. The gross national product goes up. The stock market goes up. There's lots of optimism. But America is changing. America is becoming less of a rural nation and more of an urban nation. And basically, there's a lot of differences between the countryside and the city side. The 1920 census shows, this is important, that for the first time in the nation's history, a majority of people live in towns and cities of more than 2,500 people. So more people are living in the cities than the countryside, but farming is still a very important sector of American life and the economy. About a third of American workers are still farmers. Society is becoming more like itself because you have national advertising, standardized products, you have the radio, you have magazines, newspapers. You know, the radio gets the same thing out to the whole nation. Trains allow the delivery of newspapers and magazines. So basically, the culture of the country is becoming homogenized. Sinclair Lewis writes a famous book in 1920, Main Street. He basically mocks small town America. He talks about how everything is boring in small town America. The famous newspaper editor William Allen White, he later on talks about how small towns are the utopia of the American dream, how there's neither rich nor poor, neighbors help each other. So there's kind of, whether or not it's true, I think the perception is that there's a clash between rural living and urban living in the 1920s. Um, Farmers still have a lot of problems. A fourth of the workforce in the 1920s, a fourth to a third. Um, Farming boom during World War One. I know I've said that a lot before. Farmers buy more equipment to produce more food, but then after World War One, we have too many farmers. There's kind of a rural depression. Um, Overall, though, the economy booms. Workers' wages go up. Workers' production goes up even more. Um, so a lot of the things you'll hear about the 1920s is that the rich were getting too rich and the everyone else was not getting rich. There is a bigger gap between the rich and the average person, but everybody's getting richer. So it's not necessarily like it's only one way. And when I say everybody, I shouldn't say that. Not everybody's getting richer, but generally for workers, your life is getting better in the 1920s. You have more money. You can buy a car probably for the first time. You can have a radio. You can have washing machines. So life is getting better. And part of the reason why you can have all that stuff is because everybody buys stuff on credit. Cars, radios, appliances. I keep wanting to say railroads. Cars, radios, appliances, other things, they're all bought with credit cards. Not actually plastic, but it's bought on credit. People call it buying on time. You're going to pay it off later on. They also call it installment buying. There's all these advertisements for ride now, pay later. And if you think about it, debt used to be considered immoral. You know, earlier generations of America constantly preached to their kids, don't go into debt. And if you do, get out of debt. Debt is like being a slave, it's slavery, financial slavery. Thrift and self restraint are now replaced by instant gratification of consumerism. So American culture is changing in that way. Um, and you can see on slide 14, consumer debt goes way up during the 1920s. Advertising goes up because people are trying to get people to buy all this new stuff. Henry Ford is probably the most famous person as far as the industrialists go in the 1920s. He made cars affordable for the average man, and he revolutionized the way cars were produced. He grew up on a farm in Michigan. He loved to tinker on machines. Eventually, he goes to Detroit and works in various jobs. He works for Thomas Edison at one point. He invents something called the quadricycle. You can see a picture of it there on slide 18. Um, He has a vision that the car will be something everyone can buy it someday, and that's what he ends up doing. He starts a car manufacturing company in Detroit. Later on, he starts something called the Ford Motor Company. He builds a lot of different versions, but finally, the Model T is the car that he gets right. Um, he uses scientific management principles to basically make production the most efficient he can. He studied the meat packing plants in Chicago. And in meat packing, you start off with the cow, and then you kill it, and then you tear it apart, and then you end up turning it into steak or hamburger and shipping it across the nation. So he kind of does that backwards. He starts with all the individual parts of the cars, puts them together, and then the final project is you have a car. And basically, look at slide 23. You can see this is what Henry Ford accomplishes. Before he introduces this assembly line, the Chicago meat packers used a D-assembly line or a disassembly line. Henry Ford reverses that with the assembly line. Before that, it took 12 hours to make a Model T. After the assembly line, he's making one every 90 minutes. And you can see how the price falls. The price is falling and falling and falling. In 1919, 10% of Americans owned cars. In 1927, over half of Americans owned cars. So that's all thanks to Henry Ford. He doubles the wages of his workers up to $5 a day. He reduces the workday from 9 to 8 hours. He gives his workers Saturday and Sunday off. Basically, people that support laissez-faire Republican policies, they say, look at Henry Ford. This is the way you do it. The government's not telling him how to treat his workers or manage his factory, and he's doing the right thing. He's treating them well, and he's making a profit. That's why you leave business alone. Later on, a lot of other people kind of copy Henry Ford or kind of change things up. William Durant runs General Motors and Chevrolet. Um, he allows cars to be purchased on installment plans. Alfred P. Sloan, also General Motors and Chevrolet. Um, he kind of comes up with the idea of let's have a different car for the different types of people in America. Henry Ford had one car, the Model T, and the joke used to be you can have it in any color you want as long as it's black. Well, there's a lot of rich Americans that probably want fancy, gadgets and whistles on their car, or want different colors. So Alfred P. Sloan says, let's make cars that are more fancy for kind of a higher clientele. He starts instituting new models every year. So, hey, you have the 1923 model. Well, the 1925 model has all these updates. It's way better. The automobile industry stimulates other industries. The steel, the glass, the rubber, the asphalt, the wood, the gasoline, the insurance, the road construction, those all increase. You start to have motels and restaurants pop up all over the country because people are traveling. So basically, automobile industry just stimulates all kinds of other parts of the economy. Um, Another thing that happens during the 1920s is you have the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. This is often called the Second Klan. The first Klan was kind of after the Civil War, and then you have the Second Klan in the 19 teens and 20s. It's revived in 1915 in a ceremony outside of Atlanta in Georgia. They focus on their focus of prejudice is towards blacks, immigrants, Catholics. The Ku Klux Klan also doesn't like alcohol. They think that it's corrupting modern America. So that's one of the things they kind of rally against. David Stevenson later takes over the KKK. They get up to 5 million members nationwide. Oregon has 100,000 Klansmen. The KKK is really popular outside of the South. I mean, it's always been popular in the South, but a lot of other states start to grow. The membership of the Klan grows, so it's not just a Southern phenomenon. The first Klan was a Southern phenomenon. The second Klan is kind of a nationwide phenomenon. You can see on slide 35 they have rallies and marches in Washington, D.C. They influence politics. They get senators and governors elected. A lot of senators, and not a lot, it's never a majority, but a handful of governors and senators and legislators look for endorsements from the Klan to help them win. Religious revival is also another thing that happens in the 1920s. Two of the most famous kind of radio preachers or evangelicals are Aimee Semple McPherson and Billy Sunday. I'm going to kind of let you read about them. Billy Sunday was a very animated character. He would jump up on his desk while he was preaching. He would, run around all the time in the crowd. So he was a very energetic guy. Another thing that kind of happens in the 1920s is kind of this battle between religious views and scientific views. You have something called the Scopes monkey trial. Basically, Tennessee passes a law that says you can't teach evolution. Now, there's this real small town in Tennessee called Dayton, and basically the town fathers are all sitting around one day and they say, what could we do to bring some publicity to the town? So they get this young high school teacher, John T. Scope. They basically say, will you break this law so we can kind of have some publicity? So he does. He's arrested for teaching evolution, and you have kind of the nation looking at this trial. Clarence Darrow, who's kind of the most famous defense attorney of the day, and then William Jennings Bryan, the presidential candidate, the Secretary of State, he comes to town as well. So Clarence Darrow defends John T. Scopes. William Jennings Bryan defends the law. And it's kind of like a parade or a carnival in town. You've got, thousands of people coming to this small town. You got people walking around with monkeys on leashes or monkeys dressed up in suits. You have people preaching that evolution is wrong. You have people coming and talking about science, or people talking about how religion and science don't necessarily have to conflict. All kinds of stuff going on. John T. Scopes is found guilty, but later on he's kind of let off. It's kind of a slap on the wrist. Women change in the 1920s. You kind of have a new woman emerge called the Flapper. She challenges societal norms. In the 1920s, women are more liberated. They dress differently. They wear more makeup. They dance a lot more, dance differently. Women are getting more involved in politics, in industry, in the judicial branch. On slide 50, I've got a bunch of firsts for women in the nation. Prohibition is also something that happens in the 1920s. The 18th Amendment forbids the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol. So technically, it's not illegal to drink it, but you just can't manufacture, distribute, or sell it. This goes into effect in 1919, and the Volstead Act is kind of the law that enforces the 18th Amendment. And it's very hard to shut down alcohol. There's 18,000 miles of border. People in Mexico and Canada will make alcohol and then cross the border, or they'll sail in ships to get it to America. Bootlegging and organized crime becomes large-scale business. $2 billion a year. There's all kinds of illegal places to drink called speakeasies. You get mobsters like Al Capone basically becoming powerful because of Prohibition. Al Capone runs Chicago. He owns the police. He's a nice guy and a crazy guy. There's instances where people will come try to assassinate him, and they'll machine gun his building, and innocent bystanders will get shot or hit with shrapnel. He'll go pay all their medical bills. He'll take care of them. He'll say, I'm sorry, I was the target. You shouldn't have been hurt. But then he also has crazy times where he finds people stealing from him. So he has them over for dinner, eats dinner with them, and then chains them to the seat and then beats them to death with baseball bat. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff. He orders the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where some people dressed up like police and killed kind of rival gang members. Herbert Hoover worked hard to get him in jail. Eliot Ness is eventually the federal agent that gets him in jail. He breaks up Al Capone's alcohol shipments, hurts his business. Eventually, Al Capone gets put in prison for not paying his taxes. That's what ends up happening to him. Probably the most famous person in America is Charles Lindbergh. He's the most famous person in the 1920s. That's because he does something that no one had ever done before. He flies nonstop from New York to Paris. It was a 33-hour flight, 3,600 miles. Over 100,000 Frenchmen greet him. President Coolidge sends a warship to bring him back home. 4 million Americans greet him in New York City. So he's the most popular man in America. He's Time's Man of the Year. I believe the first Man of the Year, but I'm not positive about that. So that's a little bit about culture in the 1920s. So I'll see you next time.